Welcome back. What I'm going to do in these lectures is carry us through to the end of Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. The material that we covered in the last set of lectures covered what Hume discusses in sections 1 through 3, where he lays out an account of basically where our ideas come from and how they are related to each other. So I'd like to just briefly recapitulate that material now. In section 2, Hume had said that all of the perceptions of the mind are of two types, either impressions or ideas. And by perceptions of the mind, he basically means contents of the mind, things that we can be aware of or that we can experience. Parts of our minds, so to speak. So everything that we can be aware of or can experience is of one of two kinds, either impressions or ideas, says Hume. And impressions and ideas are related in an important way, namely that ideas are copies of impressions. There are no ideas that we have that aren't copies of some impressions that we have. And the ideas tend to be paler, less vivid than the impressions that they are copies of. So this is part of how Hume says we distinguish impressions from ideas. The impressions are more lively, they're more colorful, vivacious, I think he puts it at one point, whereas the ideas are less lively, vivacious. They have less force and vivacity than the impressions. And I've tried to represent that here on the slide with the impressions at the bottom providing a kind of foundation for our knowledge, since they're the source of all of our ideas, according to Hume. And then the ideas as kind of paler reflections of those impressions, copies of those impressions that aren't quite as vivid as the impressions themselves. On the basis of this account of the contents of our mind, Hume can make some further claims about knowledge. In particular, we can say that all the things that we know are either impressions, ideas, or are some connection between ideas. And here are some ways that ideas can be connected. They can be connected through resemblance, through contiguity in space and time, that is, nearness in space and time, or by cause and effect. Since Hume also says that these are the only ways that our ideas can be connected, this basically provides a full picture of what kinds of knowledge we can have. We can have knowledge of impressions, of ideas, or of some kind of connection between our ideas. This account of where our knowledge comes from is very clearly classifiable as an empiricist approach. What defines empiricism is the view that all knowledge comes from experience. Well, you see here that the foundation of all of our knowledge on this account is the impressions that we have. And it's from those that we derive ideas and that we derive combinations of ideas which constitute our knowledge. So all of our knowledge is based ultimately on experience according to this account. It's pretty clearly an empiricist account of knowledge in that sense. So after laying out that basic account of what the human mind is like in terms of its contents and where those contents come from, which is actually a pretty simple model. He covers all the basics of the model in just 10 or 20 pages. Hume goes on to draw some consequences of this model, some implications, we could say, from this model, things that this model can show us about philosophical issues. So you remember at one point in section 2, Hume had said that the principle that all ideas come from impressions can provide a guide for us when it comes to metaphysical issues, that we can use that principle that all ideas must come from impressions to ask when we're dealing with difficult metaphysical issues about, say, free will or the existence of God, or what is a cause and what is an effect, or what's the reality of the external world. In any of those kinds of metaphysical questions, we can ask, well, the things that we have ideas of here, or in other words, the ideas that we have about this topic, or that some authors seem to be proposing about this topic, where do those ideas come from? What impressions are they based upon? If we can't say what we're talking about in terms of how it traces back to impressions, and if we can't justify what we're talking about through ultimately tracing it back to impressions, then that suggests that whatever theory we're dealing with in metaphysics is probably wrong. Okay, so what Hume is going to end up saying is that good theories in metaphysics are ones that fit this model of how the human mind works, and they don't violate the principles that have been revealed to us by this basic model of how the mind works. That restriction on what kinds of metaphysical theories are going to be acceptable ones is actually going to have very significant consequences in metaphysics. And Hume's going to draw out those consequences in the later chapters of the inquiry. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about those consequences in turn. I'm going to be a little bit quick in going through the chapters. I'm going to try to give you just the main points of the main moves in his arguments. He actually makes many, many more arguments and sub-arguments than I will be able to cover in the lectures, and I encourage you to read these texts and enjoy them, because it's actually kind of fun to see Hume make so many arguments sometimes for some of these points that he makes, and his arguments are usually based on very colorful examples, so that's fun to read and think about with him. And he also is very clever in how he describes the positions he's opposed to, where it's sort of, he's just on the edge of criticizing them overtly. He's a little bit what we might call tongue-in-cheek, in that he describes them maybe seemingly giving them a bit more credit than they deserve, but sometimes he actually comes out and is almost directly insulting about some of the positions that he criticizes. So there's a lot of colorful language in Hume that's enjoyable to read if you can get into it. So I'm going to go through these topics in order. First, induction and belief in matters of fact. Then Hume's views about causation, about free will, about miracles, and about God and the afterlife.